Thank you, everybody, for coming today. It's so wonderful to be here with you. Thank you, SAQA, for hosting us. And I'm Laura Wasilowski. I live in Elgin, Illinois, which is maybe 40 miles west of Chicago. And I'll show you my studio, and then I'm going to talk about my art a little bit. Next, please. So this is where I work. This is where I sew. This is the sewing room in the basement of my home. There on the left, you see the machine and the work tables and some of the storage areas. And there on the right is a waist height table where I make the artwork. And that's where I make my fused art quilts, on that table right there. Next, please. And this is what it really looks like. It's a big mess. I have fabric scraps everywhere. I make fused artwork, so I have a lot of leftover scraps that I use to make more artwork. So if you see the table on the right, this is what it really looks like. It's covered with Teflon. So I can fuse, I can iron the shapes right on that tabletop, and then when they cool off, I can peel it off. I'm surrounded by these scraps of fabric in different colors. They all have glue on them. They all have fusible web on them. And I can take a piece and improvise with it and put it back. And I spend a lot of time improvising and making things up from these scraps of fabrics. So you could call it recycling. I call it picking from a palette of colors. So next, please. And this is where I dye the fabric. This is my dye studio. This is on the other side of the wall of the sewing studio in the basement of our house. This is also the family laundry room. And if you look at the slide on the right, or the photo on the right, you see that there's the dyes on the shelf there that I'm going to be working with. Those are Procyon MX fiber reactive dyes. There's my washer and dryer and the laundry tubs. There's that big table that you see with the fabric on it. That is my dye table. I call it the dye table. And again, it's waist high, it's covered in canvas, and it has a little cushion to it. So I can use that table for all sorts of things. It measures maybe 48 inches wide by 72 inches long. And I use it for fusing fabrics. There you see I'm fusing some silk fabric. I use it for dyeing, where I dye the fabrics and threads I make. And I use it for printing. I use it for silk screen work and for hand stamping things. So this table has been in my workshop for over 35 years, and I have dyed there for over 35 years. I've worked at this table for a long, long time. Next, please. And this is what I make on that table. I make hand-dyed threads and hand-dyed fabrics for my artwork and for sale in my company, Art Fabric. And I use this room all the time for washing out the threads, as you can see in the buckets there. I gather the water that's coming out of the washing machine while I'm washing fabric, and I use that to rinse the thread. And eventually everything gets put back together, and I end up with these wonderful bundles of threads and fabrics. The type of fusible web I use, to answer someone's question, is Wonder Under number 805 paperback fusible web from Pelham. So this is what I produce in this room. Next, please. And here I am, happy as a little bird, dyeing fabric. So on that table, every time I dye or I print something or I do silk screen work, I have a drop cloth down. And that drop cloth is it's been infused with soda ash. So I pre-soak the fabric in soda ash, which is the mordant for Procyon MX fiber reactive dyes. So if I should drop some dye on that fabric, it instantly reacts with the fabric, and I don't have to worry about when I wash it out, I'm going to have that intense color of that dye that I just dropped on the fabric. So the drop cloths are there to protect the surface of my table and to make something from them eventually. So here I am dyeing, and next please. And this is what happens when you drop a lot of paint or a lot of dye on your drop cloths. You end up with beautiful drop cloths. This is called Painting the Town #3. And if you look at it, the background of this is one of those drop cloths. And at the time when I made this, I was painting a lot of fabric and practicing some stamps that I was designing. And my kids were at home at the time and they were practicing making stamps. So there's a lot of history with this background fabric. When I look at it, I remember what I was doing at that time. On top of the background fabric, which is a drop cloth, is a paintbrush. And that fabric that I made the paintbrush with was made on that drop cloth. So that shibori fabric was constructed, was dyed on that drop cloth, and it became fused onto the background. And I stitched it with a very plain grid. Next, please. Now this drop cloth is a little different. I had been painting fabric with some silk scarves with very light valued dyes, and it sinks through the silk and it stains the drop cloth that's underneath. And I was also practicing with more hand stamping, so that drop cloth became a combination of those pale colors that I was working with and also some of the stamping that I was doing. And what I was stamping was a black and white fabric. So I put I was stamping white fabric with black textile paint. So I put the fabric down and stamp a bunch of fabrics, and whatever leaked over or leaked through became part of that drop cloth. Painting the Town #2 is fused. The paintbrush is fused on top of one of those drop cloths. And to me, it suggests that moment in time when I was making those particular objects, the silk scarves, the stamps that I was carving, and that hand printed fabric. Next, please. And this is the quilt that is in the exhibit. It's called Painting the Town #1. This is the very first drop cloth quilt that I made with a paintbrush on it. Painting the Town #1 is a whole cloth quilt. It's all dyes and paints and stamping and roller printing that I was doing. So the background of this, that yellow textile paint, came about because I was painting some paper and cardboard and fabrics for another SAQA exhibit called Radical Elements. And I was using a lot of yellow textile paint, and it came through or went around the edges of the items that I was painting. So when I look at this, I remember that other quilt that I was making at the time. And I remember that I was printing fabrics with a roller. So if you look at that kind of hashtag looking imprint on the fabric, that's made with a roller where I'm rolling on the ink onto a fabric and going over the edges. The handle of the brush is made with mono printing. So the brush is painted. It's painted directly onto that drop cloth. And I did mono printing for the paintbrush handle, and for the ferrule and the sweep of the bristles, that's all painted on top of that background. And what I like is that the colors and the texture come through, and you see them through that blue textile paint that I used to paint the paintbrush. So to me, the paintbrush represents that act of making art. And it's sort of an extension of my hands. And it represents that moment in time, that instant when you apply the paint or the dye to the fabric. It's that moment in time when you're creating. And the fabric behind it, that represents my history. That's my history of my creative process, because I can read it like a book. And it brings back all those memories of when I was making art. So in using the drop cloths and recycling them into art, I'm sort of celebrating the creative process that we all do. And this process and I'm sure it does this for you too. This process of making gives you so much joy, and it's so good for you. And I want to thank SAQA for having these wonderful exhibits so that I can show you what I'm making and help celebrate the creative process with you as well.